Theoretical Times, a podcast series between Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, my name is Tara Brabazon and welcome to our next concept in our Theoretical Times podcast series, and this is the one I've been looking forward to. Our concept for today is foreclosure. This is incredibly interesting to me. I'm pretty obsessed about research into the global financial crisis, and obviously foreclosure is an attendant melody, an attendant refrain to the global financial crisis. But analytically, it also has links with closure, with its textual and its discursive resonance. So this is a very interesting day for me. A lot of the reading I've done through 2014 has been about the global financial crisis, what happened and when, rather than if it'll happen again. So Steve, let's start with the global financial crisis and what was the function and the role of foreclosure in the GFC?
Yes, you're right that the global financial crisis of 2007-8 and its aftermath is a major pivotal point in Theoretical Times. Theoretical Times, for listeners who are coming late to this podcast series, is a book that I'm trying to write, and I'm finding the podcast series extremely helpful in that process because I'm going back to the writing, changing things, editing things, abandoning things as a result of the podcasts and the podcast responses, actually. But I think the global financial crisis is pivotal. It's pivotal in the sense that Slavoj Žižek means it when he, in his book Event, Philosophy in Transit, which came out in 2013, he talked about global events as things where everything changes. Yeah. And I think the global financial crisis is one such event. And what I'm arguing in Theoretical Times, and obviously we've looked through theorists and we've looked through disciplines, if you like, claustropolitan sociology, bunker anthropology, and we're now looking at some of the concepts that I'm working with. We're looking at big ideas. There are certainly more than the four that we're talking about, but the four are pivotal. And they all pivot around the global financial crisis because I'm arguing that something has changed to such an extent that theorists are replacing disciplines here. We're post-disciplinary. Brilliant. And what that means is anybody's guess. You know, we've been here before where there have been crises in sociology and economics or philosophy or science or whatever. But actually this is quite fundamental in my view, and I think you're right too in what you said, that this is a global financial crisis which will continue. It's almost, as I argued in We Have Never Been Postmodern, we're post-catastrophe because we've already been through this thing where the ATMs were, 2 minutes away from being empty, which was certainly true in Europe.
Which was true in Europe and certainly true in the UK.
Yep. And it's that serious. And all the quantitative easing, which certainly isn't a neoliberal thing, it's a Keynesian thing.
That's right.
All the quantitative easing that countries like the US and the UK have engaged in since won't matter a jot.
No.
You've got countries like Russia with the ruble plummeting at the moment, oil prices plummeting, and their exports depend on high oil prices. You've got all sorts of economic issues bubbling under, but you've got social, environmental, legal, political issues, which all flow, military particularly, which all flow from that global financial crisis. The second thing, I think, is what you said about foreclosure, which we're talking about today. And there are two ways in which you can use foreclosure, and I tried to use that term in my book, We Have Never Been Postmodern, in these two ways. One of the central parts of the global financial crisis, certainly in the US, was the idea that people have been oversold mortgages.
Yes.
So a lot of the people who were oversold those mortgages couldn't pay, and they had to be foreclosed by the mortgage companies. So foreclosure was actually a term that was mentioned a lot of the time in the global financial crisis. I think there were other reasons, perhaps we'll talk about this in a minute, there were other reasons for the global financial crisis, not least the massive shadow banking scam that existed then and still exists, interestingly.
Derivatives, of course.
And you can never know how much financial crisis there really was because of that. But foreclosure, in the sense that people lost their homes, and a lot of people did lose their homes across the US and many other countries as well, and are still losing their homes. Look at Europe now. In many, particularly southern European countries, you're really talking about serious economic crises on such a scale that, you're talking back to the 30s, to be absolutely honest. But I think foreclosure in that sense is clearly a central concept, but I was also using it, and I think Paul Virilio was also using it, and I got it from him to some extent, in the sense that you were being closed off. Yeah. So social mobility, for example, is being closed off across Western countries. It's being reversed, and again, with some of the other concepts like reproletarianisation, we'll talk about that. But the closing off has all this foreclosing as a global condition, I think has a long way to go. It's pregnant with possibilities. And that we're back to the kind of structure of feeling or the structure of fear that you talked about in one of these podcasts. And I think foreclosure is a really useful concept to tease out some of these feelings, structures, processes.
But is it also a foreclosure of consciousness? Because I remember, 2014, we're at the 30th of December today, 2014. This year's about to exhaust itself. And I've spent a lot of the year reading books with titles like Scarcity, Austerity, Crisis. And I've been reading these books almost in desperation, Steve, because what the global financial crisis demonstrated, it confirmed as an evidential base, is that a particular model of neoliberalism did not work. It failed. It objectively failed. Now, what I have been unable to come to grips with is once the model failed, how did the model rejuvenate and return so rapidly, so quickly? And I remember through 2014, you, our great PhD student Mick Winter, and I, we had a great conversation about, it failed. How has this almost zombie capitalism, which is again another one of those titles of those books, how has this mode of zombie capitalism, zombie neoliberalism returned? And Mick sort of laughed and said it returned because people can't afford for it to fail. But where are you on that debate now?
I think both you and Mick have really nailed it in many ways. I think that neoliberalism certainly was the cause, in general and very specifically, of the global financial crisis. And we've had neoliberalism in the sense that we mean it today for like 40 years, basically, which replaced, in the Western countries, the post-war settlement with social justice, welfare states and so on. And it really has dug in now. The global financial crisis occurred. There was a bit of global Keynesianism, and Keynesianism in one country, like Kevin Rudd's Australia, which kept it out of recession. But actually, neoliberalism is so re-energised on such a scale now that there's almost no opposition. And, even the people like the Fukuyamas who said the end of ideology has come in the late 1980s, even they moved away from neoconservatism and neoliberalism. But I think neoliberalism is re-energising in this vacuum. I really do. Yeah. You've got, as I think I've mentioned before, you've got students at the University of Manchester, for example, in England, where I studied, who've actually developed a post-crash society, economic society, to suggest that their curriculum is absolutely meaningless after 2007-8. Yeah. And I think that's happening to a lot of student bodies around the world. No wonder they're bewildered, because the disciplines that they were being taught and are being taught have no meaning anymore. We really are, we're that deep into this morass. Yeah. And I think then we rely on theorists, is my argument, in theoretical times, in a way that we've never done before. And in some ways that's putting pressure on them, on individuals who are just celebrity intellectuals after all, to explain our society, to help us with our future. And that's a pretty big ask.
But I'm very comfortable with that because that's almost the French model of the intellectual, which I think the United States in particular walked away from. And I'm very comfortable with that Manchester Student Association because that's not a foreclosure of consciousness.
No.
My worry is, and again this links in with Zizek and the notion of the event, that my fear is it's almost as if the event has not occurred, that we're now reaching this collective unconscious. In Australia it's very easy to do that because the global financial crisis didn't happen in Australia. Yeah. It was an interesting Keynesianism in one country, so it didn't happen. But that doesn't excuse the United States or many of the European nations. So therefore, with that foreclosure of consciousness, which is my interest in this, and again, this could be a Polancian masking device, fragmentation, whatever politics you want to use on that, how are you therefore using foreclosure as a theory perhaps, or are you using it as a trope again? Is it a symbol? Is it a metaphor? Is it a metonyme? What are you doing with it?
Yes, I'm not sure I can answer that easily because I keep going back to these things. I started with foreclosure as a concept in We Have Never Been Postmodern, and I teased out lots of other things, and I kind of went back to different aspects of this theoretical edifice that I'm trying to work with, particularly this idea of claustropolitanism in general, but I think foreclosure fits into that. But also I keep changing things. When I start to work, as I did in this Spawning Life is Going to Be the Death of Me, with particular areas of empirical study of culture, like I did with my football cultures studies in that book, I found that sometimes the concepts didn't work as well as I thought they were going to, and then I had to work with others, with fragments of those concepts. So it just shows how difficult theoretical times are, actually, that you want to be careful. You want to be empirical in one sense, that you don't want to have just flights of fancy, which I've accused Virilio of doing, but also you want to have something which is complex, because these processes we're talking about are complex, and as you say, the political outcomes are really important. If people get these things wrong, then we are not able to affect any of the future society that we're talking about. So I think that these are big deals. But I think that reconstructing disciplines is actually a really difficult task. That's what I've found. I thought it was much easier than this, to talk about areas of work that I'd worked in for a long time. I thought, well, you can rework things, you can borrow things here, like magpies. But some of the concepts, I think, have still endured, and I think foreclosure is one of them. This idea of, as you say, foreclosure of consciousness is really interesting. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I'm still kind of almost obsessed with this idea of feeling claustrophobic, can't get out, want to get on the next Virgin
galactic
rocket out of the planet, which I think Virilio talks about a lot, actually, and the Virgin thing is a really interesting privatised version of all of that. But also, maybe it's the problem is the foreclosure of roots out, and that's why your idea of consciousness being foreclosed is really interesting. If you can't get people to be collectively on your side in some way, then we are finished. I mean, we've got such hyper-individualism now, consumerism gone mad, materialism gone mad, and I think you have to step back in some way and see what has been foreclosed. And I would argue particularly things like social mobility. That's where the foreclosure has started to come. And that does mean that consciousness can be changed. Because if you tell people that they're going to have a middle-class lifestyle and they ain't going to be able to get there, then that's quite a big deal.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I wonder if I can prick you a little bit with the Zizek analysis you're configuring around the event, and just again return to a very old idea that I apply, that's one of the great bedrocks of my intellectual work, which is Braudell's Annales-School analysis and his configuration of time. Because listeners may remember he had a 3-tiered strategy for thinking about the world, geography, time and space. And the 3 tiers were the longue durée, meaning the long duration, so looking at rocks, landscapes, climate. In the middle he had conjuncture, so that is 30 or 40 years, big events, so like a war and its impact. So the relationship between the First and the Second World War would be a conjuncture. And at the top are the bubbles of events. So little events don't matter too much, but those major shifts in culture do. So the question is how an event becomes a conjuncture. So probably the global financial crisis has moved from a little event where the automatic teller machines didn't have money through to quite a systemic structural change.
Yeah.
And that therefore leads to my issue about in our discussions preparing for this podcast, you've talked about foreclosure as a, quote, global condition. And I love that. I think that's important because, again, in anal school terms, that's almost a mentality. So you've talked about the global condition. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I often think that it is, a personal thing. It's actually from my northern UK roots, which meant that I lived in Manchester for a long time, and I was, a Smith's miserabilist, really. And I think I still have that, and it's a bit of an extension of that, really, this global condition. It's not going to end well. And I'm still like that. And we're sitting in Western Australia watching the Test cricket in Melbourne where it's raining, and I still feel a bit like that. So I think I am actually globalising that particular personal condition. But I do think that's something that has happened. And people are, in the argument about theoretical times, which I say is actually governed by this global event. I think, in a sense, everything starts with the global financial crisis, wherever it finishes. Theoretical times certainly is a very bewildering kind of global condition. And if I've got anything right here, this feeling of ideas, routes, processes being closed off, and we're starting to realise this foreclosure, then this is something quite gigantic and could lead to different parts of a political process which re-energises everybody. And certainly I think two of the theories that we talked about before, Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek, are extremely important here. They had a whole body of work before 2007-8, but actually they've become global theorists in this era, partly because they resurrected the idea of communism. Not necessarily the communism that had actually existed. And Žižek actually grew up in communist Yugoslavia. But actually, they are talking about a way out of the foreclosed capitalism, however shiny and bright it looks. Yeah. So Žižek talks about trouble in paradise and the new dark ages. Badiou actually talks about the resurrection of communism, which is a book that's coming out later this year, as an idea, as an event, a global event, which will actually re-energise and stop the foreclosure. Now, whatever you think about that, there have been events around the world around the idea of communism, the communist hypothesis and so on, which Žižek and Badiou have actually led. They are major theorists of that idea, and particularly that has come since 2007-8. You don't know where that's going to end, and whatever you think about the politics of that, it is a route out of the foreclosure I'm talking about. And I think what's interesting is that the foreclosure is producing not necessarily resistances, because I'm not Foucauldian in that way, but I think it's producing such global intellectual work, serious, complex global intellectual work in all disciplines that we haven't seen for 20, 30, 40 years. Yeah. So we've not seen it in the neoliberal era, because everybody gave up on the theorists that we started talking about a few weeks ago. They gave up on Althusser, they gave up on Coletti, these people were great intellectuals, in my view, and we threw the baby out with the bathwater. And we became very narrow in our intellectual vision. Actually, the one thing that's coming out of the foreclosure is a new consciousness that you talked about. Yeah. A new vision, whatever you think about it, it's there in a breadth that is just astonishing.
Because the simple answers, the simple explanations so clearly don't fit. Yeah. I think that was always my point. That's been my curiosity this year is, why do we believe this nonsense anymore? Yeah. This collective nightmare. And I think these theorists are starting to reveal to us that there are trajectories and alternatives, which is what you're talking about. Yes. So last hurrah for us, Dale. How important is the global financial crisis as an event, but as I've argued with my Nile School work, perhaps much bigger, but how important is the GFC to the work we're doing in this Theoretical Times project and agenda?
Well, I think there are two things. I think the global financial crisis was caused, in my view, by a particular application of neoliberalism. It wasn't just greed or the greed of the mortgage companies, for example.
Or what computer algorithms were allowing, faster software, faster hardware.
Although I think all of those things were important, and
Yes.
the more I've read, as you have this year, about the actual causes and the theoretical explanations for these causes, which are really quite sophisticated now, I think I've learned a lot more. But I do think that there was a whole, I would say, a corrupt shadow banking system internationally, which was created, which had the effect of the global financial crisis, but that hasn't gone away. So, and I'm not just saying, an economic event happens and therefore all the social and political and legal events follow. I'm not arguing that, but I do think the complexity of what happened in the global financial crisis and the scale of this shadow banking and indeed shadow system, I think there's shadow political systems as well.
That was also created by deregulating the banking sector for the 20 years before.
Very much so. So the neoliberalism that went before, like, as you say, the deregulation of the banking sectors and the getting rid of regulation which did exist. People like Clinton got rid of that in the United States, for example, and others followed suit. So you could follow it. You could see what was coming. But we were bereft, theoretically, I think, in all sorts of disciplines, and it's given us such a jolt. So I think that's important in its own sense, the explanation of economic and political crises. Yes. And we used to be very good at that. We're not actually very good at that anymore. But I think increasingly what we've got to do is to track the way in which the global financial crisis is changing the global condition. And the global cultural condition that I'm talking about, which I call claustropolitanism, it's really trying to get a handle on what effects there are in our culture now, and they are global, definitely, and somehow get back to a position where we can explain these things and have political and social processes flowing on from those theories.
Steve, that's fantastic. Very important podcast. This is the one I've been looking forward to, and I think we've captured a lot of my disquiet, my concern, but also how proud I am of so many scholars around the world who have, I'll use the cliche, stepped up to the plate and tried to provide complicated answers to very complicated situations rather than sort of PR or Fox News blurbs. So thank you for that conversation. And I think we'll now move on to, in our next podcast, the other key concept that I'm incredibly interested in, which is reproletarianisation. So see you then. Thank you for listening to this podcast on Theoretical Times by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.